the ballroom air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition crackled with silent judgment. At its center stood Jack Adler, a man whose net worth could buy countries his face, a mask of cold fury. Beside him, his wife Lenora was a quiet island in a simple, unadorned dress. He'd called it a charity case costume, a pathetic insult to his name. But he didn't know the secret stitched into its very seams, a secret history waiting for the spotlight. In 1 hour, that simple dress would not only unravel his carefully constructed empire, but would redefine power before the eyes of the city's elite. The marble foyer of the Adler estate was a cavern of cold, polished silence, a space designed to intimidate, not welcome. It was a perfect reflection of its owner, Jack Adler. He stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the silk lapels of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. Every detail was an exercise in perfection, a testament to the brutal, meticulous control he exerted over his world, from the boardroom of Adler Industries to the precise angle of the baccarat crystal glasses on his bar. Tonight was the annual Metropolitan Philanthropy Gala, the undisputed apex of the city's social calendar. For Jack, it wasn't about charity. It was a theater of war. It was where billion-dollar deals were seeded with a handshake, where rivals were sized up and subtly dismantled, and where his power was put on full dazzling display. And every king needed a queen. He turned his eyes narrowing as Lenora descended the grand, sweeping staircase. She moved with a quiet grace that always seemed to defy the oppressive grandeur of their home. But it wasn't her grace he saw tonight. It was her dress. It was a simple sleeveless sheath dress made of a deep sapphire blue silk that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. It had no jewels, no sequins, no intricate beadwork. Its cut was classic, almost vintage, hugging her form elegantly, but without fanfare. In a sea of couture gowns that would soon surround them, it was the equivalent of a whisper in a room of screams. "What is that?" Jack's voice was low, stripped of all warmth. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Lenora's hand smoothed down the side of the dress, a gesture that was both nervous and protective. "It's my dress for the gala." "Don't be absurd," he snapped, taking a step closer. His gaze raked over her, a physical act of disapproval. "My assistant laid out the Valentino gown, the one that cost more than your father's car." "Where is it?" "It didn't feel right, Jack," she said softly, her eyes pleading with him to understand a hope she knew was futile. This one has meaning." "Meaning?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Lenora, we are not going to a community theater production. This is the Met Gala. The people there don't care about meaning. They care about price tags. They care about brand recognition. They care about the message we send. And this," he gestured dismissively at her, "sends the message that my wife is a charity case." The word struck her like a physical blow. She flinched, her shoulders tightening. She had known he wouldn't like it, but the raw contempt in his voice was still a shock. "It was my mother's," she finally managed to say, her voice barely audible. "She designed it." This information had no softening effect on Jack. If anything, it hardened his expression. Lenora's mother had been a brilliant but obscure textile artist, a woman who valued craft over commerce, a concept utterly alien to him. "So it's not just cheap, it's sentimental nonsense," he concluded. "Go upstairs and change. Now. We're going to be late, and I will not have you embarrassing me. Not tonight." He turned his back on her, a gesture of finality, and checked his Patek Philippe watch. It was a command, not a request. He expected her to scurry back up the stairs defeated. But Lenora didn't move. For 5 years, she had been the perfect billionaire's wife. She hosted his flawless dinner parties, charmed his business partners, and wore the clothes he bought for her. She had slowly allowed her own identity, the bright, passionate landscape architect she had once been, to be paved over by the sterile, manicured perfection of Jack's world. She had told herself it was a compromise, a small price to pay for a life of security. But standing there, clutching the soft silk her mother had once poured her heart into, she realized the price had never been small. It was everything. "No," she said. The word was so quiet, Jack almost didn't hear it. He turned back slowly, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "What did you say, Thong?" "I said no." Lenora repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm wearing this dress." Jack's face, which was usually a carefully controlled mask, contorted with a rage he rarely let show. He stalked towards her, his 6-foot frame towering over her. He stopped just inches away, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "You are my wife," he seethed. "Your appearance is a reflection of me, of my success. When people look at you, they are supposed to see a woman who has everything because her husband is powerful enough to give it to her. This threadbare relic makes me look weak. It makes us look weak." He reached out and pinched the fabric of her sleeve between his thumb and forefinger, his lip curled in disgust. "This is not a negotiation. The world we are about to walk into is a battlefield, Lenora, and you are showing up in your pajamas. Go. Change." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to do as she was told, to restore the fragile peace that barely existed between them. But then she thought of her mother, of the strength and integrity she had lived by. She thought of the woman she herself had been before the diamonds and the hollow praise. "If you are so ashamed to be seen with me, Jack," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken, "then perhaps you should go alone." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Jack stared at her. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped in his cheek. He saw not his wife, but an act of rebellion, an asset that was malfunctioning. He had neither the time nor the inclination to deal with it. "Fine," he bit out, his voice like ice. "Have it your way. But when they're all laughing at you, don't come crying to me. You'll be on your own tonight." He turned on his heel and strode out the massive oak doors, not once looking back. The doors boomed shut, leaving Lenora alone in the echoing silence of the foyer. The simple blue dress, her only armor for the war she was about to face. The limousine ride to the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a study in Arctic silence. Jack stared out his window, the vibrant lights of Manhattan flashing across his stony face. Lenora sat opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap, feeling the profound chasm that had opened between them. It had always been there, of course, a quiet crack in the foundation of their marriage. But tonight it had split wide open, and she feared they had both fallen in. When they arrived, the scene was a chaotic symphony of wealth and fame. Flashes from paparazzi cameras exploded like fireworks. Reporters shouted names, and a river of designer gowns flowed up the iconic museum steps. Jack stepped out of the car first, immediately plastering a charismatic smile on his face for the cameras. He was a performer, and this was his stage. He waited for Lenora, his hand offered not as a gesture of support, but as a prop. As she emerged, a collective pause seemed to ripple through the nearest photographers, their lenses so accustomed to the glittering, the extravagant, the ostentatious, seemed momentarily confused by her simplicity. The flashes faltered. Lenora felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes like tiny needles. She could hear the murmurs begin a low hum of confusion and ridicule. "Is that an Adler? What is she wearing? Did her luggage get lost?" Jack's hand tightened on hers, his fingers digging into her skin. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes were chips of ice. "Smile," he hissed through his teeth. His voice a venomous whisper, meant only for her. "You wanted to wear the rag. Now own it." Inside the grand hall was even more intimidating. It was a jungle of silk diamonds and egos. Women who looked like goddesses drifted by their gowns trailing behind them like magnificent plumage. And then there was Lenora in her quiet blue dress. She felt like a wren in a flock of peacocks. Jack immediately abandoned her. He spotted Desmond Kincaid, the formidable CEO of a rival tech firm he was trying to force into a merger, and strode towards him, a shark sensing blood. Lenora was left standing alone, a solitary island, in the swirling currents of the Gala. The whispers grew louder now, less guarded. She saw the city's reigning socialites women she had hosted for lunch just weeks ago huddled together, their eyes flicking towards her, before they hid their smirks behind champagne flutes. One of them, a notoriously sharp-tongued woman named Beatrice Dupont, glided over. "Lenora, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "How brave of you. Such a minimalist statement. Is it a protest against consumerism?" Before Lenora could formulate a reply, another voice, smoother and more dangerous, cut in. "Oh, I don't think it's a statement, Beatrice. I think it's a cry for help." Lenora turned to see Bianca Laurent, a model-turned-socialite who had been clinging to Jack's orbit for the past 6 months. Bianca was everything Lenora was not tonight. Her dress was a scandalous confection of sheer lace and strategically placed crystals by Zuhair Murad, leaving little to the imagination. A waterfall of diamonds cascaded from her neck. She looked expensive, predatory, and utterly pleased with herself. Bianca's eyes swept over Lenora's simple dress with theatrical pity. "Darling, did you have a dreadful accident on the way here? A fire, perhaps? You know Jack would buy you 1,000 dresses if you just asked." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or maybe you don't need to ask anymore." The implication was clear, a poisoned dart aimed directly at Lenora's heart. This wasn't just about a dress. This was a territorial display. As Bianca sauntered away, leaving Lenora reeling, she saw Jack across the room. He was deep in conversation with Kincaid, but he was also watching her, a cold, clinical expression on his face. He saw the socialites whispering, saw Bianca's cruel triumph, and he did nothing. In fact, a small, cruel smile played on his lips. This was her punishment. He was letting the wolves have her. He chose that moment to compound the humiliation. He gestured for a waiter and took 2 glasses of champagne. He then walked not to his wife, but directly to Bianca, handing her a glass. He leaned in, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh, a triumphant tinkling sound that echoed across the cavernous hall. He put his hand on the small of her back, a gesture of casual intimacy that was both a betrayal and a public declaration. Everyone saw it. The whispers intensified no longer just about her dress, but about the spectacular public implosion of the Adler marriage. Lenora felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to run, to disappear, to simply melt into the floor. Jack caught her eye from across the room. his gaze filled with a cold, triumphant challenge. See his look said, "This is what happens when you defy me. I can replace you in an instant." He then turned his back on her, completely laughing with Bianca and Kincaid, leaving Lenora utterly devastatingly alone. The dress wasn't just a piece of fabric anymore. It was a symbol of her isolation, a target for the scorn of an entire world, and the catalyst for her husband's final public rejection. The night was still young, but for Lenora it already felt like the end. Lenora stood frozen, the symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter fading into a dull roar in her ears. Each glance in her direction felt like a physical blow. Jack's public dismissal, his blatant intimacy with Bianca, was the final twist of the knife. He wasn't just ashamed of her. He was actively engineering her social ruin. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might faint. She retreated, finding a small, shadowed alcove behind a marble column, a desperate attempt to become invisible. She clutched her small, simple purse, her knuckles white. She could leave. She could call a car and slip out a side door, escaping this coliseum of cruelty. The thought was a sweet, tempting relief. But then she felt the smooth, familiar silk of her dress beneath her fingers. She thought of her mother, a woman who faced down gallery owners and dismissive critics with unwavering belief in her own work. Her mother had never backed down from a fight, especially one that mattered. "Integrity is the only thing they can't take from you, Lenora," she used to say. "Don't you ever give it away." Leaving now would be giving it away. It would be an admission of defeat, an acceptance of Jack's narrative that she was worthless without the trappings he provided. A new, unfamiliar fire began to smolder in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't courage, not yet, but it was a stubborn refusal to be extinguished. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out from behind the pillar. She would not hide. She would endure. As she scanned the room, forcing herself to meet the curious and pitying stares, she noticed a man observing her from a distance. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a shock of silver hair and intelligent, discerning eyes behind a pair of stylishly thick-rimmed glasses. He wasn't looking at her with pity or scorn. His expression was one of intense, scholarly curiosity. He seemed to be looking not at her, but at her dress, as if it were a rare manuscript he was trying to decipher. A moment later, as she accepted a glass of water from a passing waiter, she overheard a fragment of conversation that made her pause. Jack was holding court with Desmond Kincaid and a few other corporate titans. "The Adler brand is about unparalleled excellence," Jack was saying, his voice resonating with practiced confidence. "Every detail, every asset must reflect that. There's no room for sentimentality in my world. Only strength." He subtly gestured towards Bianca, who was now draped on his arm. "Vision, and an eye for timeless value." Kincaid, a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper instincts, listened with a neutral expression, but his eyes flickered over to where Lenora stood, a brief, unreadable glance before returning to Jack. Lenora sensed a subtle shift in the dynamic. Jack thought he was impressing Kincaid, but she wondered if the older CEO saw something else entirely, a man who treated his wife like a disposable commodity. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, however small, Lenora began to move through the room again. She wouldn't engage, but she wouldn't hide. It was during this quiet, lonely promenade that she passed a discreetly placed television monitor displaying a looping video about the evening's charitable cause. And then she heard it, a name that sent a jolt through her entire body. The gala, the announcer's voiceover explained, was also a tribute. Tonight, they were honoring the legacy of the late legendary actress Audrey Dubois, a star from the golden age of Hollywood, known for her timeless elegance and fierce independence. The centerpiece of the evening's auction would be the sale of her personal letters. Audrey Dubois. Lenora's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It couldn't be. The world tilted on its axis. She looked down at her simple blue dress, the dress her mother had designed. The dress her mother had made not for herself, but for her dearest friend and confidant, a woman she had met long before fame found her. A woman named Audrey. Suddenly, the older man with the silver hair was standing before her. He had a kind academic air about him. "Forgive my forwardness," he said, his voice a gentle baritone. "My name is Professor Alistair Beaumont. I was the curator for the Hollywood Decades exhibit at the V&A Museum for many years." Lenora simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Professor Beaumont's eyes were fixed on her dress, alight with an almost reverent excitement. "I have studied every known photograph, every frame of film of Miss Dubois. There are sketches of this dress in her private journals, but it was believed to have been lost for over 50 years. Lost in a fire, the story went." He looked from the dress to her face, his eyes full of questions. "May I ask, how did you come to be in possession of a masterpiece?" The word masterpiece hung in the air between them, a stark contrast to Jack's cruel rag. At that moment, Lenora knew the evening was about to change. The seeds of doubt had been planted not in her own mind, but in the minds of everyone who was about to witness the truth. The power was shifting, and the storm was about to break. The low hum of conversation in the grand hall began to quiet as the master of ceremonies, a famous late-night host, took the stage. A massive screen descended behind him, and the lights dimmed, casting the attendees in an expectant twilight. "Tonight," the MC began, his voice smooth and captivating, "we celebrate not only philanthropy, but also the enduring legacy of a true icon. A woman whose grace and talent remain unmatched. The one and only Audrey Dubois." A cheer went through the crowd. Lenora's heart hammered against her ribs. She was standing near the edge of the room, still in the company of Professor Beaumont, who had been listening with rapt attention as she quietly began to explain the dress's origin. On screen, a beautifully edited montage began to play. It was a whirlwind of black and white film clips, Audrey laughing in a romantic comedy, weeping in a drama, her expressive eyes conveying a world of emotion. The accompanying music swelled a classic score that evoked an era of lost glamour. Jack stood near the front, Bianca still possessively attached to his arm. He looked bored, glancing at his watch. This tribute was merely an obstacle, a delay before the main event of networking and deal-making resumed. He was completely oblivious, cocooned in his own arrogance. The montage continued, showing Audrey at premieres, accepting awards, her style evolving. Then the narrator's voice deepened. But beyond the celebrity, there was a private Audrey, a woman who valued loyalty and friendship above all else. Her closest confidant was not a Hollywood star, but a brilliant textile artist, Eleanor Vance, a woman who understood her not as an icon, but as a friend. Lenora gasped. He had said her mother's name. Eleanor Vance. On the screen, a rare personal photograph appeared. It was a picture of a smiling Audrey arm in arm with a younger, vibrant version of Lenora's mother. They were standing in a garden, laughing, the picture of genuine affection. And then the final stunning clip began. It was a screen test raw footage that had been recently unearthed. In it, Audrey wasn't wearing an elaborate costume. She was wearing a simple, elegant sapphire blue sheath dress. She moved across the set, the silk flowing around her, the color a vivid jewel, even in the vintage film. She spoke directly to the camera, a quiet, intimate monologue about her dreams. The dress was unmistakable. It was the dress Lenora was wearing. A collective audible gasp swept through the hall. It started as a ripple. A few people in the front row turned their eyes wide. Then a few more. Heads began to swiveling one by one, a wave of realization washing over the crowd. The whispers started again, but this time they were not of scorn, but of pure, unadulterated shock. "Look! Is that? My God, it's the same dress!" The spotlight operator, sensing the sudden shift of energy in the room, followed the sea of turning heads. The beam detached from the now empty stage and swept across the audience, searching for the source of the commotion. It landed with dramatic precision on Lenora. She was bathed in a brilliant white light, the sapphire blue of her dress, suddenly vibrant, alive. For a moment, there was absolute silence. In that single breathtaking instant, she was no longer Jack Adler's insignificant wife. She was a living piece of history. Professor Beaumont, seizing the moment, took a half-step forward. His voice, trained for lecturing in grand halls, carried across the room with effortless authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone ringing with triumphant discovery, "what you are witnessing is not a replica. I can stake my entire professional reputation on the fact that Mrs. Adler is wearing the Lost Star-Seeker dress designed for Audrey Dubois by her dear friend Eleanor Vance. It is a priceless piece of cultural history, thought to be gone forever." The silence shattered. The room erupted in a cacophony of noise, exclamations, applause, the frantic clicking of phone cameras. Everyone was on their feet, their attention utterly and completely fixated on Lenora. Across the room, Jack stood, frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. His face was a canvas of pure disbelief, his eyes wide with shock. He looked from the screen to Lenora and back again. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Bianca had physically recoiled from him, her own face a mask of jealousy and rage. The rag he had mocked, the charity case costume he had despised, was the star of the evening. And his wife, the woman he had tried to humiliate and discard, was standing in its center, outshining every diamond, every designer label, every single person in the room. The spotlight he craved, the attention he demanded, was hers, and he had no idea what to do. The world, which for hours had been a swirling vortex of scorn and indifference, snapped into a new sharp focus around Lenora. The spotlight was a physical weight, a sudden heat on her skin, and the applause that erupted was not a gentle wave, but a crashing tide of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the grand hall. For a disorienting second, she felt her breath catch in her throat. This attention was 1,000 times more intense than the earlier ridicule, a brilliant, terrifying glare that threatened to consume her. Phone cameras were held aloft, their flashes creating a galaxy of tiny, exploding stars all aimed at her. The whispers had transformed into a roar of exclamation and disbelief. She felt the gentle, steadying presence of Professor Beaumont beside her. "Breathe, my dear," he murmured, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. "This is your moment. They are seeing the truth." On stage, the master of ceremonies, ever the professional, capitalized on the astonishing turn of events. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed into the microphone, his voice resonating with genuine excitement. "It seems history has just walked into the room. Mrs. Adler simply incredible." His words amplified the applause, giving it a seal of official validation. The crowd, a collection of the city's most powerful and cynical figures, began to surge forward. They were drawn by an irresistible magnetism, not just of celebrity, but of authenticity. This was a real story, a hidden treasure revealed, and it was infinitely more compelling than the manufactured glamour they were used to. Beatrice Dupont, the woman whose earlier brave comment had stung like venom, was now at the forefront, her face a desperate mask of admiration. "Lenora, you must forgive me. How could we have known? It's simply divine." It was in that moment, besieged by a sea of fawning faces and flashing lights, that Lenora made a choice. She could be a passive spectacle, an object to be gawked at like the dress she wore. Or she could be the author of this moment. She thought of her mother, of Audrey, two women who commanded their own narratives. Straightening her shoulders, she took a quiet, centering breath and found her voice. As if sensing her intention, a respectful hush began to fall over the nearest groups. Reporters strained to listen, microphones extended. It was Lenora who spoke, her voice clear and measured, carrying an unexpected resonance in the vast hall. "The dress, it has a story," she began, her eyes not on any one person, but on the collective, captivated audience. "It's a story about a friendship between two young women long before the world knew one of their names. My mother, Eleanor, wasn't just a designer. She was a storyteller who used thread instead of ink. She and Audrey met when they were waitresses, sharing tips and dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly distant." She paused, letting the intimacy of that image sink in. Across the room, Jack watched, his mind struggling to compute the scene. This was Lenora, his quiet, compliant wife, holding a room of titans in the palm of her hand, with a story he had dismissed as sentimental nonsense. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had tilted beneath his feet. The world was no longer operating according to his rules. "My mother made this dress for Audrey's first major screen test." Lenora continued, her hand gently smoothing the deep blue silk. "She worked on it for weeks in her tiny apartment, the fabric laid out over the dining table. She called it the Star Seeker. When Audrey asked why, my mother told her, 'Because when you wear this, they won't see a costume or a character. They will see the star you are, and they won't be able to look away.' It was meant to be her armor, a reminder of her own inner light." The story, so personal and heartfelt, was a stark contrast to the evening's calculated displays of wealth. Lenora wasn't talking about couture. She was talking about love. Audrey believed it was her lucky charm, but after she became famous, she returned it to my mother. She said its magic had worked, and now it needed to be kept safe as a symbol of their friendship, a reminder of a time when they were just Eleanor and Audrey. It was never lost in a fire. That was a story they invented to protect something precious from a world that only understands price tags. My mother left it to me not as an artifact to be sealed away, but as a living reminder to always be true to your own story. A profound silence followed her words. She had done more than just explain the dress's origin. She had redefined value for everyone in the room. In that moment, the million-dollar diamonds and exclusive gowns seemed gaudy and meaningless next to the quiet, priceless legacy Lenora wore. It was Desmond Kincaid who broke the spell. He had been watching the entire exchange with an astute, unreadable expression. Now he began to walk toward Lenora. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that parted the crowd before him. He bypassed Jack, who stood awkwardly a few feet away. As if he were a piece of furniture Kincaid didn't need to navigate around. He stopped directly in front of Lenora, his eyes holding a look of deep and genuine respect. "Mrs. Adler," he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone that cut through the lingering murmurs. "That was one of the most compelling stories I have ever heard. Your mother was a woman of immense talent, and you are a woman of immense grace. It is an honor to meet you." Jack saw his chance slipping away the entire evening, spiraling out of his control. He lunged back into the scene, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and false. He placed a possessive hand on Lenora's shoulder. "Desmond, amazing, isn't it? I always told Lenora she had hidden treasures. She's full of surprises." It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to reclaim ownership, to absorb her light into his own. Kincaid's gaze flickered to Jack's hand on Lenora's shoulder, and his expression hardened with a subtle yet unmistakable disgust. He turned his attention back to Lenora, dismissing Jack so completely it was as if he had ceased to exist. "Mrs. Adler," Kincaid said smoothly, "my wife and I would be honored if you would join us at our table. Frankly, your story is far more interesting than any business I had planned on discussing tonight." It was a public checkmate. In one perfectly executed move, Kincaid had aligned himself with Lenora, validated her worth, and cast Jack out into the social wilderness. The invitation was a declaration, and everyone in the room understood it. Lenora looked at Jack. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the frantic confusion of a king who had just learned he was a pawn in a much larger game. Without a word, she subtly shrugged his hand off her shoulder. Turning to Kincaid, a small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that evening. "I would be delighted, Mr. Kincaid." As she took Kincaid's offered arm and walked away, the crowd parted for them as if for royalty. She did not look back. She didn't have to. The power in their marriage, in the room, in the city's highest echelon, had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably rewritten, leaving Jack Adler standing utterly alone in the void she had left behind. Jack Adler was not a man accustomed to being invisible. He was a gravitational force. People, deals, and opportunities bent toward him, drawn in by the sheer mass of his wealth and power. Yet as he stood rooted to the spot, watching Lenora being led away to Desmond Kincaid's table, he felt a terrifying lightness. The gravitational pull had reversed. He was no longer the center of the universe. He was a cast-off moon, drifting into the cold, empty darkness. The vibrant sounds of the gala, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses seemed to warp and distort, reaching him as if through a long, echoing tunnel. He could feel the stares, hundreds of them. Before, he had thrived on being watched, interpreting every glance as a sign of envy or aspiration. Now the gazes felt different. They were laced with a humiliating cocktail of pity and morbid curiosity. He saw a man who had begged for a meeting with him last week, now whispering to a companion, their eyes flicking toward Jack before they both shared a smirk. He was no longer a predator to be feared. He was a spectacle to be observed. A deep, primal rage, hot and acidic, churned in his gut, but it was trapped beneath a layer of cold, paralyzing shock. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, a pathetic, reflexive gesture of a man trying to smooth out a life that had become irrevocably wrinkled. He had to regain control, reassert the narrative. But before he could even formulate a plan, he saw Desmond Kincaid stand up and look directly at him from across the room. Kincaid gave a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head toward the glass doors leading to the outdoor terrace. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. For the first time in his professional life, Jack followed. Each step he took felt heavy, as if the plush carpet were trying to pull him under. He felt the weight of the room's attention on his back, a silent audience watching his walk of shame. The night air on the terrace was cool, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. Below them, the city glittered a sprawling tapestry of lights that Jack had always viewed as his kingdom. Tonight it just looked distant and indifferent. Kincaid stood by the balustrade, not looking at the view, but at Jack. His expression was one of cool, clinical assessment. "I've been in this business for 40 years, Adler." Kincaid began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I've seen men build empires, and I've seen them burn them to the ground. It almost always comes down to one thing: how they assess value." Jack opened his mouth to speak, to offer a defense, but Kincaid held up a hand, silencing him. "Tonight I saw your assessment skills in action. You had a woman of substance, grace, and historical significance by your side. A living, breathing masterpiece. And you treated her like a flawed commodity you were eager to offload. You publicly humiliated her and tried to replace her with a trinket." The word hung in the air, a devastatingly accurate description of Bianca. "Desmond, you're misunderstanding a private marital dispute." Jack stammered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Am I?" Kincaid's voice sharpened. "No, I'm seeing a man who is so obsessed with the superficial shell of success that he has become completely blind to the substance within. You don't just do that with people, Adler. You do it with companies. You'd acquire my firm, strip it for its most obvious assets, and discard the foundational culture, the very thing that makes it truly valuable, because you lack the vision to appreciate it. Your behavior tonight wasn't a private matter. It was a character prospectus, and frankly, I'm not buying." The finality in Kincaid's tone was absolute. Jack felt a cold dread wash over him. "So that's it. Because of a dress." Kincaid let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You still don't get it. It was never about the dress. It was about what it revealed about you." He turned to face Jack fully, his eyes like chips of flint. "The merger is off. Adler Industries will receive a formal notice in the morning. I don't partner with men who possess such monumentally poor judgment." Without another word, Kincaid turned and walked back into the Gala, leaving Jack alone with the silent, glittering city. The billion-dollar deal, the crowning achievement of his year, had been undone not in a boardroom, but by his own petty cruelty. He stumbled back, inside his mind a maelstrom of fury and denial. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for an anchor, an ally. He spotted Bianca near the bar, looking anxious. He took a step toward her. His hand slightly raised, a desperate king looking for his last loyal subject. She saw him coming. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, not with sympathy but with alarm. In a movement so swift and decisive, it was an art form, she turned her back to him, raising her phone to her ear in a clear universal sign. "Do not approach me." She then melted into a nearby group, laughing at a joke she hadn't heard. The transaction was over. His currency was worthless. The evening was ending. The grand hall began to empty, the tide of couture and diamonds receding, leaving behind the debris of crumpled napkins and abandoned glasses. Jack stood near the main entrance, a sentry guarding the ruins of his own life. He watched as the last of the guests departed, offering air kisses and promises to call. He was a ghost in his own party. Finally, he saw her. Lenora was walking toward the exit, engaged in a quiet, warm conversation with Professor Beaumont. She looked serene, unburdened. The sight of her peace fueled his rage. "We are leaving," he bit out, as she drew near, his hand shooting out to grab her arm, a last desperate attempt to physically impose his will. Lenora stopped. She did not struggle or cry out. She simply went still, and then with a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled her arm from his grasp. The gesture was more powerful than any shout. "No, Jack," she said, her voice soft, but imbued with a strength he had never heard before. "You are leaving. I will be taking a separate car." His face contorted the carefully constructed mask of the billionaire CEO, finally shattering to reveal the snarling, insecure man beneath. "You did this," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "This whole night, that dress, that ridiculous story. You planned all of it just to humiliate me." Lenora looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a trace of fear in her eyes. There was only a deep, profound, and devastating pity. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked, her voice steady. "You believe I orchestrated a tribute to Audrey Dubois and planted a world-renowned fashion historian in the crowd just to embarrass you. Your narcissism is truly boundless." She took a small step closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You did this to yourself. I gave you a choice this evening in our home. You chose to mock a dress that held my family's history. You chose to parade your infidelity in front of the entire world. You chose to value a brand name over a human being. These were all your decisions, Jack, born from a desperate need to prove you are powerful. But true power isn't about humiliating those you perceive as beneath you. It is about having the grace to recognize the value in things that don't have a price tag. That is a lesson you are incapable of learning." She paused, letting the truth of her words settle in the cavernous space between them. "You were so blinded by the glare of your own success that you couldn't see the masterpiece right in front of you. That is not my failure. It is and always will be yours." With that, she gave him a final sad nod. "My lawyer will be in contact with yours in the morning." She turned and walked away, joining Professor Beaumont, who was waiting discreetly by the door. Jack watched her go, every word she'd spoken, a nail in the coffin of his pride. He was left standing utterly alone in the grand marble hall as the cleaning staff began to move around him, their indifference the final crushing confirmation of his fall. He had lost the deal. He had lost his mistress. He had lost his wife. He had unraveled thread by thread until there was nothing left. The morning after the gala broke not with the gentle glow of dawn, but with the harsh, unforgiving glare of a global media firestorm. The story had gone supernova overnight. It was a perfectly crafted fable for the digital age, a tale of hubris and humility, of hidden value and superficial pride, all captured in high-definition photographs. For Jack, the awakening was brutal. He was roused from a fitful sleep, not by his silent alarm, but by the incessant angry buzzing of his phone on the marble nightstand. He swiped it open to a digital guillotine. His face was everywhere, a frozen mask of shock and disbelief. Beside it, Lenora, bathed in the spotlight, looked like a figure from a forgotten, more elegant era. The headlines were merciless, each one a hammer blow to his ego. Forbes ran a scathing analysis titled, "The Price of Everything, the Value of Nothing. How Jack Adler's ego cost his empire billions." The New York Times style section published a moving piece on the Star Seeker dress, branding it an emblem of quiet integrity in an age of loud luxury. On social media, the hashtag #AdlersFolly was trending worldwide. He hurled the phone across the room, where it shattered against a cold, unfeeling wall. He was trapped in his own mansion, a sprawling mausoleum of his success where every polished surface now seemed to mock him with his own reflection. He tried to command his world back into order, as he always had with phone calls. He called his head of peer, the line went to voicemail. He called his lawyer, who answered with a strained, weary professionalism that offered no comfort. He called board members, men he'd once commanded only to be met with icy distance. The transactional friendships he had cultivated for decades evaporated in the heat of a single scandal. He was radioactive, and no one wanted to be near the fallout. The crushing silence of the house, once a symbol of his supreme control, was now the sound of his profound, absolute isolation. Lenora, by contrast, woke up in a sunlit suite at the Carlisle Hotel, having never returned to the mansion. She had ordered a simple breakfast and watched the same news unfold on a television with the sound turned low. She felt no giddy sense of triumph, no thirst for revenge. Instead, a quiet, profound sense of release settled over her. The woman on the screen, so poised and dignified, felt both familiar and new. It was the woman she was meant to be finally emerging from the shadow of the woman she had been forced to become. Her newfound celebrity brought a deluge of offers. A high-powered PR agent secured by her new lawyer laid out a dazzling roadmap for her future, a multi-million-dollar book deal, a seat on the board of a major fashion house, a reality show. "You're not just a socialite anymore, Lenora," the agent had said, her eyes gleaming. "You're a brand, a symbol of authenticity. We can monetize that." Lenora listened politely, then gave her answer. "Thank you for your work, but I have no interest in being a brand. My story became public by accident, but my life from this point forward will be private by design." She had spent 5 years as a public accessory. She refused to spend the rest of her life as a public commodity. She did, however, agree to one public endeavor. She met with Professor Beaumont at the museum, which was already being flooded with requests to see the now famous dress. "It deserves to be seen," she agreed, "but not as a curiosity, not as the dress that brought down a billionaire." With a clarity that surprised even herself, she laid out her vision. "I want the exhibit to be called Eleanor and Audrey, A Friendship in Silk. It should be small, intimate. It will feature the dress, yes, but also my mother's design, sketches her letters to Audrey, photographs of them together before the fame. I want people to see the artistry and the affection behind the glamour. It's a story about 2 women supporting each other's dreams. That's the legacy I want to honor." Professor Beaumont was visibly moved. "My dear Mrs. Adler," he said, "that is a truly magnificent idea." While Lenora was carefully curating her past to build a meaningful future, Jack was watching his own past be systematically dismantled. The board of Adler Industries convened an emergency meeting. Jack patched in via a video link from the sterile gloom of his home office, watched as the people he had appointed, mentored, and bullied turned on him. His face a pale, pixelated square on a giant screen was a ghost at his own corporate execution. He was given a choice: resign immediately with a severance package or be fired publicly for bringing the company into disrepute. Stripped of his power, he was left with no cards to play. He accepted the resignation. The next day, a sterile press release announced he was stepping down to pursue other interests. The business world knew exactly what that meant. He was finished. The divorce was an administrative footnote in the grander collapse of his life. Humiliated and advised by his lawyer to avoid a protracted public battle, Jack agreed to Lenora's terms. The settlement was substantial, a figure that would allow Lenora to live in comfort for the rest of her life. But comfort was not her goal. Purpose was. Inspired by the overwhelming public response to her mother's story, she saw a path forward. She sat for days, not with lawyers, but with financial advisors and philanthropic consultants. She wasn't building a brand, she was building an institution. She legally established the Vance Foundation for Independent Artisans. Her mother's name, now a symbol of integrity and unrecognized genius. The foundation's mission was to provide grants, studio space, and mentorship to craftspeople who worked outside the mainstream weavers, ceramicists, woodworkers, and textile designers whose focus was on skill and artistry, not mass production. Her new life took shape, not in the spotlight, but in the quiet, focused work of building something real. She bought a charming, slightly overgrown house, upstate, a world away from the cold marble of the Adler estate. It had a sprawling garden that had been neglected for years, and she found immense joy in digging her hands into the soil, slowly coaxing life and order from the chaos. It was a mirror of her own journey. One crisp autumn afternoon, she sat at a simple wooden drafting table she'd placed in a room overlooking her burgeoning garden. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She wasn't designing a landscape. Spread before her were sheets of high-quality paper, and with a set of charcoal pencils she was sketching. It was a dress simple and elegant. It wasn't a copy of the Star Seeker, but a spiritual successor, a design born of its principles of grace and quiet confidence. She was not her mother, a master of the craft. She was a landscape architect, a nurturer of growth. But in that moment, she was also her mother's daughter, a weaver of new beginnings. She worked with a small, peaceful smile on her face, the sound of birds outside her only company. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's grand game or a reflection of someone else's success. She was the artist, the architect, and the masterpiece, all in one, finally designing a life entirely of her own. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a dress. It was a story about value. Jack Adler saw value in price tags and brand names, a shallow, fragile foundation that crumbled under the first real test. Lenora, guided by her mother's legacy, understood that true worth lies in history, integrity, and authenticity, qualities that can't be bought, only earned. Her quiet strength in the face of public humiliation became her ultimate victory, proving that the most powerful statement isn't always the loudest. She didn't just win back her dignity. She built a new future from it. What did you think of Lenora's journey? If her story of quiet triumph and profound karma resonated with you, please hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and empowerment. We love hearing your thoughts, so leave a comment below.